Whispering Woods. It was said that deep in the heart of Whispering Woods, there was a cabin. Old and weather-beaten, it stood as a remnant of a long-forgotten past. Many had heard stories of the woods, how the wind itself seemed to carry voices, whispers of the dead, they said. But few dared venture inside, and even fewer returned to tell the tale. This is the story of one who did. Emily had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Ghost stories, haunted houses, and cursed forests, they were nothing more than folklore to her. So, when her friends challenged her to spend one night in Whispering Woods, she laughed it off and accepted. After all, it was just a night in the woods. What could go wrong? Armed with nothing but her phone, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag, Emily set off into the woods. The air was cool, and the leaves crunched beneath her boots. It was late afternoon when she reached the clearing where the cabin stood. The structure was more dilapidated than she'd expected. The windows were cracked, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, Emily was determined to prove her friends wrong. She stepped inside. The interior was cold, much colder than it should have been for the time of year. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling. The silence was oppressive, save for the occasional creak of the old wood beneath her feet. She set up her sleeping bag in what must have once been the living room and settled in for the night. As the sun set, the forest outside seemed to come alive. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and creating an eerie melody. Emily sat by the small fireplace, the only light coming from the flickering flame of a candle she had brought with her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At first it was subtle, a creak from the floorboards behind her, a soft rustle from the dark corners of the room. But soon the sounds became more distinct. A whisper, faint at first, barely audible over the wind. Emily froze. She strained to listen, her heart pounding in her chest. Leave. The word was faint, almost as if the wind had shaped it. But then it came again, louder this time. Leave. Emily's hands shook as she grabbed her flashlight and shone it around the room. There was no one there. She was alone, or so she thought. She tried to convince herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from the very fabric of the cabin. Emily could barely make out the words, but they all carried the same message. Leave while you can. She decided she couldn't stay inside the cabin any longer. Grabbing her things, she bolted for the door, but the moment her hand touched the doorknob, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emily screamed and stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The whispers turned into wails echoing throughout the cabin. The air grew colder, and she could see her breath in front of her. Panic set in. She banged on the door, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't budge. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, standing in the doorway of the next room. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The shadow seemed to pulse, growing larger, closer. Suddenly the whispers stopped. The cabin fell deathly silent. And then the shadow spoke. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was deep, guttural, like the sound of rocks grinding together. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. The shadow began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. She stumbled over a chair, falling to the floor. Her flashlight rolled across the room, casting long, eerie shadows. In the dim light, she could see something. Carvings on the walls. Symbols scratched into the wood with something sharp. They pulsed, faintly, as if alive. The closer the shadow got, the brighter the symbols glowed. Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What had she stumbled into? What was this place? The shadow was nearly upon her now. She could feel its cold presence like ice in her veins. She crawled backward, her back hitting the wall. There was nowhere left to go. Just as the shadow reached out, the door burst open. A blinding light filled the room, and the shadow recoiled, screeching in pain. Emily shielded her eyes, unsure of what was happening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The shadow was gone. The whispers had stopped. The cabin was silent once more. Dazed and shaken, Emily stumbled out of the cabin and into the night. She didn't stop running until she was out of the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally reached the safety of her car, she looked back one last time. The cabin stood there, dark and silent, but in the distance, just barely visible through the trees, she saw them, figures, standing among the shadows, watching her. She never returned to Whispering Woods, but the whispers never truly left her. After that terrifying night in Whispering Woods, Emily tried to move on with her life, but things were never the same. The cabin had left its mark on her in ways she couldn't fully understand. The whispers from the cabin, though faint now, continued to echo in the back of her mind. At first, she only heard them when she was alone at night, soft murmurs just beyond the edge of hearing. But soon, they became louder, clearer. They followed her everywhere. The dreams were worse. Every night, Emily found herself back in the cabin, the walls closing in on her. The shadow would be there, waiting, watching. Sometimes it spoke, sometimes it didn't, but the message was always the same. You shouldn't have come. It wasn't long before Emily's friends began to notice her change. She was distant, jumpy, plagued by dark circles under her eyes. Sleep came in restless, fractured pieces, and her days were filled with an unshakable sense of dread. She avoided her friends' questions, insisting she was fine. But deep down, she knew that something was very wrong. Then one day, the nightmares bled into reality. It started with small things, objects moving around her apartment, lights flickering, strange noises in the night. At first, she tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the feeling that she was being watched never left her. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she heard it again, the voice from the cabin. This time, it was clear as day, a low, guttural whisper in her ear. Come back. Emily sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, but her room was empty. The air was still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was there with her. The next morning, she found scratches on her bedroom door. Long, jagged marks, like something with claws had tried to get in. That was when she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Emily decided to return to Whispering Woods. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She wasn't sure anyone would believe her if she tried to explain. Armed with a backpack filled with supplies and a camera to document whatever she found, she drove back to the woods, her heart heavy with dread. The drive felt longer this time. The trees seemed taller, their shadows darker, as if the woods themselves knew she was coming. When she finally reached the clearing, the cabin stood there, just as decrepit as she remembered. But something was different. The air around the cabin was thick, almost suffocating. The whispers began the moment she stepped out of her car, barely audible but unmistakable. They seemed to swirl around her, carried by the wind, pulling her closer. Emily took a deep breath and walked toward the cabin, her steps slow and deliberate. The door was still hanging crookedly on its hinges, creaking as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold, just as it had been before. But this time, the cabin felt alive. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the symbols etched into the wood glowing faintly. The air was thick with tension, as if the cabin itself was waiting for something. Emily pulled out her camera and started filming, trying to capture whatever was happening. As she explored the cabin, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a layer of dust and debris, was a trap door. It looked old, the wood rotting and splintered. She knelt down and brushed away the dirt, her heart racing. There was something written on the trap door, symbols, the same ones carved into the walls. Without thinking, she reached for the handle and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the earth. A cold draft rose from the darkness below, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Emily hesitated. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn back, to leave the cabin and never return. But the whispers were louder now, urging her forward. She turned on her flashlight and descended the stairs. The air grew colder as she went deeper, the light from her flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The walls were damp, covered in mold and strange symbols. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small underground chamber. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But at the center of the room was something far more disturbing. A circle of stones surrounded by candles. In the middle of the circle lay a book, its pages yellowed with age, written in a language Emily didn't recognize. The symbols matched the ones on the walls of the cabin. She stepped closer, her flashlight flickering. As she reached for the book, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The darkness closed in around her, and the whispers became deafening. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. Emily's heart raced as she spun around, her flashlight flickering wildly. The air was thick with malice, and the whispers were no longer distant. They were all around her, overlapping, growing louder and more urgent. "You shouldn't have come back," they hissed. Emily backed away from the circle, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She ran toward the stairs, but before she could reach them, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed and fell to the floor, her flashlight rolling away. In the dim light, she could see a hand, pale, skeletal, reaching out from the shadows. The ground beneath her began to shake, the walls creaking and groaning as if the cabin itself was alive. The whispers turned to screams, echoing in her mind. Emily scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, from the darkness, the shadow emerged. It was taller than before, its form more distinct. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly in the dark. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the fear that radiated from her. "You were warned," it growled, its voice reverberating through the room. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, her body growing weaker with every passing second. The shadow reached out, its fingers long and sharp. As it touched her, a searing pain shot through her body. Emily screamed, collapsing to the ground, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the shadow looming over her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. When Emily woke, she was outside the cabin, lying on the forest floor. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the clearing. She was alone, her body aching and cold. Her backpack and camera were gone. She never spoke of what happened that night. But the whispers, they never left her. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is silent and the shadows are long, she can still hear them. You shouldn't have come back.